rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà. Bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, e viva il comunismo e la libertà, avanti il popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, bandiera rossa.
Okay, comrades, welcome to the Workers' International Network meeting on Black Lives Matter, the US and international perspectives. We welcome you all. We've got a really extraordinary lineup today of US Black women activists, a woman trade union leader, and Black Lives Matter activists in Africa and in Britain. We've keen interest from a range of activists in the US and elsewhere. As was said by his brother at his funeral, George Floyd is going to change the world. The revolutionary upsurge around the globe and the worldwide participation here shows the explosive interest in Black Lives Matter. The Workers' International Network encourages democratic debate based in the workers' movement, and we look forward to your contributions and perspectives. We have the following speakers and commentators from the front line. Tia, who's just been mentioned, who really is on the front line in Louisville, hoping to join us soon. She's an activist, and Daytran Wilkin is a spokesman for the City Waste Union in New Orleans and the niece of one of the striking hoppers. Prison labour has been used against strikers and the struggle is continuing there. Julia Wallace is a rank and file member of Service Employees Industrial Union, SEIU Local 721, where she is active in fighting to disaffiliate all police unions from the union. She is a writer and frequent contributor to leftvoice.org. And John Ryman, a socialist commentator who produces a regular blog and participates in the Workers' International Network. He was a leader of a wildcat action in the 1999 Wildcat Storm of East Bay, Carpenter's. These are our four main speakers, but I'd also like to welcome a number of others who have received the invitation and indicated they would like to contribute, including Jack Gearson, a socialist who works in teacher and other activist networks, and from Africa, Fando Gumidi, a leading feminist activist for Black women and racial justice in the Black Lives Matter framework in South Africa. Jabu Nala Hartley, leader of Black Lives Matter Oxford and in the local Labour Party campaign for a living wage. She's been the most prominent speaker at Rhodes Must Fall rallies, which has succeeded in getting Rhodes statues removed from Oxford University. There are more who've indicated that they would like to speak, but due to the time constraints of this meeting, I apologise for the fact that we can't get you on the list, but if you indicate that you want to come in, I'll make sure that I'll get you in early. Now, you'll probably be aware that the way to do that is if you click on participants, then you'll see three little dots at the bottom, and on the list, the drop-down list, you can raise your hand, which is one way of indicating you would like to speak. It's the best way because then I can get everyone in order and they can come into the discussion. And of course, there are others who are supporting this movement, Black Lives Matter, and this is one of the most vigorous international movements of our time. Now, I mentioned the time constraints. I'm going to ask the four main speakers to keep their lead off to 10 to 15 minutes. And other participants will have five minutes to speak. So without further ado, is Tia here now?
I'm afraid I don't see it. I'm texting her, but let's make a start without her, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay, so is Datrian here?
I've also texted her and let's see. Yeah.
Okay, Julia Wallace. Oh, Julia.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me to, can you hear me? Everyone can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak, to be part of this discussion. I just wanted to say, just as a moment, if people could just mute your phones, mute what you're saying, or I don't know, that might be easier so then we don't hear what you're saying or have any feedback. Yeah, good job. All right, so again, my name is Julia Wallace. I'm a frequent contributor to leftvoice.org, which is a revolutionary socialist press. And I'm also a member of SEIU Local 721, and I'm part of the Drop the Cops, No Cops in Our Union movement that's been happening in the last just few weeks. In the past month, we've really seen an intensification of the fight against sexism and racism, as well as extending a fight into the fight against systemic racism. And I think part of the reason why these struggles have been so profound and in themselves international versus other uprisings that have happened in the United States where people felt solidarity versus this kind of being taken on in other countries as their own is because of the economic crisis that's happened as well as because of the pandemic. Both of those issues have led to an increased oppression and exploitation of workers, particularly Black and brown workers. Black and brown workers have tended to be the most precarious and have higher instances of unemployment, as well as people who are doing essential jobs. Now, essential jobs meaning people who are working at McDonald's, people who are working at Amazon, as well as healthcare workers. Included in that, the higher cases of people dying and being infected with COVID-19 have been disproportionately Black and brown people, as well as other issues of racism within the medical care industry and other problems. And so the fact that the people who have been the most expressive, volatile, and combative in the streets shouldn't come to a surprise that it's also these groups of people, particularly precarious, unemployed Black and brown youth. But what also makes this particularly profound is that this international wave has also reflected in the violence of the police and the state internationally. So you have huge protests in London, you have huge protests in Brazil, in France, all over the world with tens of thousands, each one with their own stories and issues of their own problems with the police, their own histories of the police murdering people. So for example, João Pedro, who was murdered in Brazil recently. A lot of the protests that have happened have been around that. And there's also just been an increasingly multiracial character of these protests. So tending, like with the protests that happened around the Black Lives Matter movement in 2016, you had people who there was mainly Black people, and this is clearly Black-led and a Black-led movement, but it's a multiracial character of these struggles. And so for my part, we've considered, well, how can we take this moment of combativity, of people challenging every aspect of the racist system that we live under, and kind of maintain it to become more of an explicitly anti-capitalist one. And I think part of that has been the call to abolish the police. There have also been calls to defund the police that have exposed the incredible amount of money that the police have, In Los Angeles, for example, over 50% of the budget is for the police alone. So it shouldn't also be a surprise that the LAPD is the most murderous police department in the United States. But defunding the police and replacing them with social workers, I am a social worker, that's not enough, because if we look at, and I'm just taking my city, Los Angeles, as an example, we have 60,000 people in Los Angeles that are homeless, and there's about 40 or 50 billionaires that live in the city alone. So you have a situation of extreme poverty. Having more social workers, people who are able to help and de-escalate situations, is a good thing, and we should all support it. But it doesn't challenge the fact that you have an extreme amount of poverty and wealth inequality, and that is part of the racist nature of capitalism. The police have to be violent, because that's the way they're able to enforce this huge amount of wealth inequality. That's the way they're able to enforce all this racism. They have to be that way, and the fact that they are particularly sadistic in certain instances is the price of doing business for the capitalists. However, the capitalists are now having to kind of give up some of those issues, or having to give up some of that money, and that's being challenged. And so for us, I think we really need to consider how we can, as workers, continue to do that. With the disaffiliation of the police, SEIU has particularly organized a lot of law enforcement, and that's a problem, because law enforcement is the enemy of the working class. In the 1990s, the Justice for Janitor strike that happened, the police were particularly oppressive to the workers, and that's the role that the police play in strikes. Furthermore, you have an example like Rayshard Brooks, who was murdered by the police. The cop who murdered him is an SEIU affiliate member. That is completely unacceptable. And so the labor movement and the workers movement, we really need to expose these issues and really make clear that the police are a class enemy. They're not workers, they're paid to oppress us. And if we understand that the police come from the strike breakers, the Pinkertons, and we understand that the police also come from the slave patrols and protecting private property, in that instance, Black people who were property, it's also important for us to understand that we're not fighting for better working conditions for our oppressors. We're not fighting so that they have more rights. We're fighting so that we eliminate them and eliminate the system that maintains them. I'd also like to point out that in this international organizing against racism, that we also need to be anti-imperialist. The US is the cop of the world, I think, and imposes its military rule around the world, whether that be through economics and economic sanctions, or outright supporting brutal dictatorships or attempting coups like they've done in Venezuela. And so it's important for us to really be supporting and building the power of working class people, oppressed people, as part of our fight against capitalism, because capitalism needs racism to exist to divide the working class, and also to pay certain workers and to treat certain workers less than others, to have folks buying into the system, and also to extract more profits by paying people less than others. The final thing I kind of wanted to conclude on is that where do we kind of go from here? In part, the struggle for workers, as I had mentioned, was the disaffiliation from that, but also that we need to defend ourselves against these police and against these racist vigilantes. Part of the reason why I think one of the speakers may not be here is because a vigilante murdered one of the Black Lives Matter protesters in Louisville, Kentucky today. In Seattle, they shot someone, tried to kill him. It was a Proud Boy who tried to kill him. He was rescued by the protesters. The police stood by and did nothing, and then they rescued him. And now the mayor, the Democratic Party mayor, is attempted to use that shooting to attack the occupation. So a lot of these liberals are, you know, claiming to be on their side and trying to co-opt it, especially with the elections. But it should be clear that in a lot of these places, like Louisville, like Atlanta, like Minneapolis, where the most clear instances of police brutality that are in the headlines, these are run by Democrats, these are run by Democratic Party mayors, and they're run by Democratic Party governors. And so we need to be also making clear that we need political organization in our own name, that is of working class people and oppressed people. So we have a lot of work to do. The uprisings that have been happening are extremely important. They've been happening every day since George Floyd was murdered. And so for us, for our part, we can in the United States oppose imperialism and US imperialism in particular in the countries that we're in, as well as organizing against police and against the capitalist system and against imperialism. Those systems need racism to exist, and it's our duty to point those out, as well as building solidarity amongst each other. As the capitalists are international, our struggle should be international, not just in slogans, but in on the ground, consistent and persistent organizing. A last point on the assemblies that are happening, part of our ability to organize in the long term needs to be that these assemblies, that we expand them so that we have a way to dialogue. You know, we can march every day, but really we need to have a consistent way that we can exchange with each other and debate with each other to figure out the best ways forward. And I appreciate this event that's happening, because that's another way in which we can continue to do that internationally, so we figure out the way we can defend ourselves. And lastly, a note, sorry, I keep saying lastly, but it's final one, I promise. There's a history of self-defense in the United States and around the world. And it's important for us to really study those things, from the Black Panthers to Deacons to a Defense to the defense of the Seattle 1919 general strike and other strikes that have happened. And I think it's important for us to also bring together those fightbacks, those armed fightbacks of working class people and oppressed people. We need something that brings, I don't know, marriage is a weird word, but kind of combines those two ideas of a mass movement centered on the working class, of oppressed people, all of them fighting against capitalism and imperialism and racism. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what other folks have to say. We're in an incredible moment where we need to have bold ideas and be very open about our politics in terms of revolution and in terms of socialism, and be unafraid of that, because the Republicans, the Democrats, both of those things are trying to repress and co-opt this movement. So we need to really try to bring ourselves together and show people how, you know, the sky's the limit. And I'll just end with a quote from Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto and Assata Shakur, that we have nothing to lose but our chains. Thank you.
Julia, that was really brilliant. What a way to open up a meeting such as this. You've set the standard now. And so for the rest of the speakers, there's your challenge. Pick up from there. So does anyone know if Tia is in the meeting? I didn't see her name, but you can't always tell from someone's ID. Let's have a quick look. Okay, I'm going to.
I haven't had an update, so I'm afraid we're not too sure. She did say her battery was so low she didn't know if she could connect.
Okay, all right. So for the comrades who've more recently joined, we have Tia was going to speak from Louisville, and there's been a shooting in Louisville, and she's part of the Black Lives Matter campaign. So that's really taken her attention away. What about Datrian? Is she here? Do you know, David?
Dave, I don't get a response right now. I think we should move on, and I think she may well join in. Yeah.
Okay. All right, John, I know you're here, John Ryman. Would you like to go next, please?
Okay, so comrades, what the United States is really facing today is a massive perfect storm, which is to say several storms combining and multiplying the effects of each other. And we've already seen two of these storms with more yet to come. The first, of course, is COVID-19, which entirely disrupted US and world capitalism, both economically and politically. And incidentally, it gives a whole new, more literal meaning to the saying that when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Then we also see the other storm is this massive movement against police racism and police violence. And both of these storms have been a long time in the making. As far as COVID-19, as we've discussed in a previous meeting, that derives from the entire way that capitalism collides with nature in the realm of food production and also in the realm of land development. And as far as the police, you've seen a massive use of police violence. And last year, for instance, it was found that the police killed 3 people per day in the United States. And of course, it's greater amongst the Black population. Of the people that were killed, 24% of those people killed were Black people, whereas Black people composed 13% of the US population. So they had about double chance of being killed by the cops. And this is due to a combination of factors. First is, ever since the 1980s, there's been this campaign against so-called violent criminals, which is really a racist dog whistle, and for law and order. And all of that meant to give an increasing free hand to the police to go in, especially into the Black communities, and to loot, to murder, and to conduct mayhem. And I should mention, incidentally, that all wings of the capitalist politicians, including both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, participated in that campaign, that law and order campaign. And it was doubly necessary in the Black community, which amongst Black workers, they have been living under really Depression-era conditions economically, as far as unemployment, poverty, and so on, for many, many, many decades. And therefore, the police have gone into the Black communities, especially as an occupying army, and seeing Black people as the enemy, just as when US soldiers, let's say, invaded Iraq, they saw the Iraqi people as the enemy. And these two storms have combined with the third one, which is the loss of the capitalist class's control over their own presidency. And we have to look at that situation quite closely, because it is almost always the crises within the capitalist class that have led to revolutionary developments in general in society. And the mainstream of the capitalist class has always opposed Trump. And there is another wing, as represented by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, who came on board as far as supporting Trump after his tax cuts of 2017. But they never really controlled him either. They were more or less like riding a tiger. And as we all know, it's well and good to ride the tiger, but what happens when you want to get off? So traditionally, if you look at the Trump administration, a US president in general will bring in all different representatives of different wings of the capitalist class into their administration. And debate and discussion is held within that administration. And they will do the same thing within their own party. But also traditionally, president has been kind of as much as he can, and it always has been a he, has been kind of the uniter in chief that seeks to bring along different sectors of the middle class and the working class behind them. And we saw, just for instance, what Bush did with the invasion of Iraq, which initially had majority support in the United States, but not Trump. What he's done, he was an outlier from the start. There was no wing, even the Wall Street Journal was totally opposed to him as he was trying to get the nomination 4 years ago. But he had his own independent base. And after he came in the last year or so, then he has consistently weeded out any voices that are independent of him and more connected with different wings of the capitalist class. He has weeded them out from his own administration. I'm not saying Trump is anti-capitalist, but he is somewhat independent of and risen somewhat above the capitalist class. And so how and why did that situation develop where the capitalist class, and especially its mainstream, largely lost control over their own presidency? And in the first place, they have developed for decades now, ever since the 1980s, this the Christian fundamentalist fanatics. And they built that up in order, just as they built up the Law and Order campaign, in order to distract attention away from their attacks on the working class. Now these Christian fundamentalists have become like a Frankenstein monster that have become somewhat independent of the capitalists, of the mainstream of the capitalist class. And this reflects, on the one hand, the long-term weakening or basically the end of the American dream. And if you look, for instance, at the decline in home ownership, which has always been in the United States kind of served as a partial alternative to the social programs and the economic security that those programs offered in Western Europe. That is over and done with, especially for the younger generation. We also see the decline in power of US capitalism, US imperialism abroad, where they're no longer able to just impose their will and have to compromise. And in fact, if you just look at the nuclear agreement that the US led the way under Obama in agreeing to with Iran. In the past, US imperialism would have just imposed its will on Iran. And if they couldn't, then they would have organized a coup to overthrow the Iranian government. They couldn't do that, so they had to have a compromise. And if you think about what Make America Great Again means, it means return of the American dream, which is impossible, and return to US domination worldwide, which is also impossible. And in fact, Trump explicitly talked about the Iran nuclear deal as an example of the weakening of US imperialism. Then you also have the decline in class consciousness. And although, like every other class, the US working class does have a class consciousness, but it is weaker than it is in many other industrialized countries. And we should never forget the role of the union leadership in this, where they have conducted a 50-year campaign against class solidarity, against class struggle, and against class consciousness. They've done that both in the realm of general propaganda, in the realm of action, as far as imposing second-rate or third-rate contracts, and against that wing of the union membership that has sought to maintain the best traditions of class solidarity. They've belittled that wing of the membership, sought to isolate and ostracize them, and if necessary, actually collaborated with the employers in getting those members fired and or blackballed. And that's led to a situation where 30% of union members 4 years ago voted for Trump. And that means that probably the majority of white union members voted for Trump. At the same time, you have a massive alienation of union members from their own unions. In my area, for instance, most, especially younger union members that I talk to, they don't even know the name of their own union. That's how absent it is from their daily work lives. So all of this, the murder of George Floyd and what led up to it, the other similar murders, has brought all of this to a head, and it's created an absolute crisis in the Trump administration. And up until then, Trump had moved to consolidate his power. And with the protests, then he took a further step to try to impose direct, to start to impose direct military rule over the United States, starting in Washington, D.C. And that was a step too far, even for the editors of the Wall Street Journal and who they represent. They all spoke up against him. And even the military officers, speaking through a series of retired high-profile generals, spoke up against him in that case. And it created such a crisis that even his Secretary of Defense, Esper, and the head of his Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, who was also a general, had to retreat from that. That was a serious defeat for Trump, and he had to step back. And that defeat was reflected in the polls, whereas previously the gap between those who approved and disapproved of Trump was about 5%. That is 5% more disapproved of him than approved. Now that gap is about 15%. And Biden, by just simply laying low in the basement and keeping his mouth shut, now has 50% support versus 36% support for Trump. Now there's another element of the perfect storm that's headed this way, and that is the economic disaster that will be hitting most likely in early August, because at the end of July, employers are going to be able to lay off millions of workers and not have to pay back the loans that they got. And also, you will have the end of the $600 a week supplement to unemployment insurance. And added, so what I think will very likely, I don't see any way that it can be avoided, what likely to happen will be a massive wave of evictions right at the time that COVID-19 is accelerating. We should bear in mind, incidentally, that even prior to this crisis, there was one eviction every 4 minutes in the United States. That was even when the economy was going well, supposedly. So I think as far as the perspectives for the coming election, that it's impossible to predict with any certainty, just as like it's impossible to predict with any certainty the exact path of a hurricane. But as things stand right now, Biden is well ahead of Trump. But we simply don't know to what extent he'll be able to suppress the vote. And incidentally, he's moving very strongly to suppress the write-in ballots. And the possible stopping of functioning, and it is actually possible, of the Postal Service. If that happens during the election, then the write-in ballots are over with. So you have this enormous, the crisis of these tectonic plates colliding. And just to give some visible examples, you have, I had not heard, like comrades were mentioning, the murder of in Louisville, but you have a group of former retired cops on a Facebook page for cops down in Los Angeles openly talking about murdering a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement. You have a series of rural sheriffs who are openly urging the people in their counties to defy the law as far as wearing masks. And then, just to give an example, you had some testimony in Palm Beach County, Florida, against a proposed ordinance for people to have to wear masks in public. Here's what some of the people were saying. One of them said, masks are killing people. Another said, this is a pandemic. Another said, do we want to be known for communist dictators? The problem with Americans today is ignorance, arrogance, and apathy. I mean, maybe she was talking about herself. Another said, God gave us the very breath to breathe, and where do you get the authority to reduce my oxygen? And finally, one said, we will get together and do a citizen's arrest on every single human being that goes against the freedom of choice. You really cannot mandate wearing a mask knowing that that mask is killing people. and every single one of you that are obeying the devil's law are going to be arrested. Now that is a direct threat to carry out violence. And you have to realize these people, the speakers like this, they represent about 10% of the US population. But there's an additional 20 to 25% that more or less sympathize with them. So this is not just the outlier of a few thousand individual lunatics. But then you have the other side. There have been over 2,000 protests in every single state in the United States against the murder of George Floyd. And over 2/3 of the US population supports those protests. So the question for us is how we're starting to find, oh, and I forgot to mention as far as the labor movement, that we had that West Coast port shutdown a week ago in support of the George Floyd protests. But we've had those, that was very good. It was a real demonstration of the power of the working class. But the question is it going to be just one and done, such as similar port shutdowns have been in the past? Or is it going to be used as a springboard towards the labor movement actually leading the way in building a wider movement? And there's some indications that that may happen, but it will happen against the resistance of the entire leadership of the labor movement. So the question is, how will a new mass working class organization develop out of this chaotic mass movement that exists? Which is to say, how can a mass working class party start to be developed and be born? And that, of course, involves a whole a whole other discussion. So thank you.
John, thank you very much. I think you rose to the challenge there and made some really, really strong points that will certainly come up in the discussion. Okay, as far as I'm aware, Tia has lost the battery on her phone and so at this present time can't join us. If she does obviously come online and people are still coming online, she'll be given a chance to speak. As far as I'm aware, Datrian also hasn't appeared. So I'm going to ask Jack Gerson whether he'd like to make his contribution now. Jack.
Yeah, sure. So I have 5 minutes, right? Okay.
Or maybe a bit longer, Jack, given...
Well, we'll see. Since I was told 5 minutes, we'll see what I have to say. So I'm not going to speak about the U.S. presidential race in 5 minutes. I agreed with a lot of what Julia said. I agreed with some of what John said, much of it. I didn't. I am not. My crystal ball is broken, though, so I'm not sure on the timing of all the events of economic shutdown, COVID, and so on are going to all coincide in early August or wherever, but I'll try to get it working again, and if I have more time, I will let you know what it says. Meanwhile, before I finish, I have a couple of points that Jack Heyman, the ILW Local 10, asked me to make, and I will make them. So if I forget to make them, please remind me, since I told him that I would make them for him. So first of all, it seems to me that we all know that there have been already very clear effects of this movement, which is a movement in many ways unprecedented in my lifetime. In some ways, it's as though you have compressed the movements of the 60s side by side. Not all of the aspects of the movements of the 60s, and certainly not matured, but you have mass majoritarian protests. In fact, I'd say a much broader reaction against racism, not necessarily deeper, but broader in the population than there was in the 60s. You have the huge mass mobilizations, and they are reaching, as John said, far further into the country, where you have thousands of communities which have had these demonstrations. At the same time, you have a militant wing that's emerged. In some ways, people, some of whom passed through Occupy, learned lessons in Occupy, These are going on side by side, but there's a much more multiracial character, a leadership by young people, especially young people of color, and I think that that's very important. So you've had already tangible effects. The Minneapolis City Council voted to disband the police. Defund the cops is a slogan which is very vague and perhaps not meaningful, but it's going around from community to community. Apple, Amazon, Google are contributing $100 million apiece to anti-racism causes. Racist statues are being toppled around the country. In Oakland, the Oakland School Board voted to disband the Oakland School Police. That vote took place a few days ago. That's something that some of us have been calling for 15 years. And the Oakland School Police are murderers. We've had protests against the murder of Raheem Brown and others by the Oakland cops who just promoted the murderers. The fact that it's been taken up now and passed by a school board, which not only opposed disbanding them, but used the cops especially against the union and against community. As recently as November, the Oakland School Police beat and actually hospitalized one of the organizers, community organizers, at a school board meeting when there was a protest there. So, so there's a clear shift now, and everybody is trying to get on board the support for this movement. So in Oakland, for example, the most anti-union and pro-corporate member of the school board, Jamoki Hodge, is the maker of motion to disband the Oakland School Police, who she's been the strongest supporter of. I understand in Los Angeles, Monica Garcia, who has been the biggest promoter of charter schools, president of the school board there for years, has made the motion to do the most cuts. So I think we have to be aware that this is going on. And the question to me is, why aren't the corporations and neoliberals feeling threatened, more threatened, or are they? Or are they feeling so threatened that they feel that they have to do this? That IBM feels that it has to do away with facial recognition, that Amazon puts a hold for a year on facial recognition, hoping that things will pass by. And so the question is, what can be done to deepen the movement, to sustain it, and to go beyond just a majoritarian movement where there is a general understanding of the disgrace of racism and the conditions that Black people have been forced to live under for centuries, to actual mass movement against capitalism and to change the conditions. Because as long as I taught at Castlemont High School in East Oakland, which is one of the many poster high schools for disaster, for worst high school in the universe. There's a tie of many of them. My students at Castlemont knew that for the most part, for most of them, the future was very limited. It was to go into the military, die in the streets, or end up through the school to prison pipeline in jail. 1 out of every 3 students in Castlemont, men and women, was in the system, that is, had been jailed by the time before they were 15 years old. They knew what was coming. How are these conditions going to change? Black men make up about 5%, give or take a percent, of the US population, over 40% of those incarcerated, for example. So one of the important things that I think needs to be taken up is not, defund the police. What does it mean? But I would say demilitarize the police and go after the entire repressive state apparatus, end the school to prison pipeline, end mass incarceration. And doing that is going to mean a movement against capitalism, but in a transitional movement, demands, I would say, jobs for all, housing for all, healthcare for all, quality education, and to defund the repressive state apparatus, the surveillance state, all of the Star Wars equipment, cut the military by a huge factor, close all foreign bases as a starter, and withdraw all troops from abroad. If we're going to talk about anti-imperialism, and I agree with Julia about that, there's the first concrete thing that can be done. There's a massive amount of money that ought to be going into the kind of services that are needed. Instead, what we're getting is largely transfer social programs from the police to social welfare agencies. Well, it's better that that be done, I guess, and certainly it's not meaningless, but it's far from what's needed. These are drops in the bucket. Oakland has a $300 million police budget. It's the city council voted to cut it by less than 5%, by 14.5 million, but the real cuts are only 2.5 million, less than 1%. These are drops in the bucket. And there's something else, which is when all is said and done, capitalism needs cops. They're going to fund the police one way or another. Police are funded heavily through private foundations, police foundations, similar to what goes on with the schools, where in affluent communities, private parents get together in nonprofit foundations and fund their community school, their public school. So in the affluent Oakland Hills, schools are heavily funded. In the flatlands, schools are a disaster, terribly underfunded. So the cops are going to likely get money one way or the other because capitalism needs to have the police of one form or another to protect the haves and their property from the have-nots. Okay. Now, some things that I think ought to be done is, first of all, and there's beginning to be some precedents for this, to get police unions, to get cop unions out of organized labor. The Seattle Labor Council voted a week ago Wednesday to kick the Seattle police out of the local labor council. Jack Heyman asked me to pass along that ILWU Local 10 bans cops from membership. This is starting to come up in the Alameda Labor Council and elsewhere. As Leon Trotsky said in his German writings in What Next, when a worker becomes a cop, he ceases to be a worker. The role of the cops is every day to break up strikes, to go against the community, to act as John said, an occupying army, and also as border guards to protect the affluent and the white communities from the poor and the Black communities, people of color. So that's the first step. Secondly, not just police unions, but in going after the school to prison pipeline and ending mass incarceration, one of the things that will happen and needs to happen is a huge reduction in the number of prisoners and in prison guards. Prison guard unions in California have been an extremely reactionary force, as police unions have been around the country. So I don't have time to go into, and I could give details of how police unions have censored and gotten award-winning lesson plans and units pulled down from the Oakland Unified School District website. Police unions in Philadelphia, reaching out through Fox News, censored a whole unit done by Oakland teacher Craig Gordon, which is an award-winning unit on Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, because one of the lessons mentioned Mahmoud Abu-Jamal. And the only way we got that back is through collaborating with our longtime ally Jack Heyman and the ILWU to have a joint campaign against it, which culminated in Jack getting Alice Walker to write an open letter, and the school board backed off. So I'm passing that along from Jack, who asked me to say that as part of, just mentioning what police unions have done. And the censorship they've done there and the political lobbying has gone on around the country and in a very reactionary way. Okay. Now, finally, I'm just gonna close with defending the right to vote. John brought up what's being done with mail ballots. Trump just replaced a few months ago the head of the Postal Service with his own man. That wasn't done by accident. That's done to give him control. and there may very well be an attempt to defer the election, to postpone the election. Trump is trailing in polls by, the New York Times poll had him trailing by 14%. He is currently acting to solidify his base as much as possible. And I believe that if the election isn't deferred, there's going to be massive attempts on disenfranchising voters and voter fraud around the country. That's already happening with the voiding of mail-in ballots, not allowing them in Wisconsin, Texas, and some other states. In Georgia, the last gubernatorial election, the Democratic Party candidate, Stacey Abrams, a black woman, really won the election, but except for the invalidation of votes, not allowing many to vote, and so on. This is an old story in the US from both parties, but it's especially being done by the Republicans now. And defending the right to vote, I think, is perhaps the most critical thing to do in the coming election. I don't really have time to talk about more, and I also didn't prepare more than about 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop there.
Jack, thank you very much for that contribution. Much appreciated. Again, very interesting. It's great that people are bringing different issues up. It's just going to make the discussion really, really interesting. I understand Tia, I certainly clicked on her name recently. So is Tia there? If so, can you unmute?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, great. Would you like to speak then, please?
Yeah, I only have like 6% left. So is there anything specific? Because it's so much going on. Like last night, somebody was shot and killed at our camp. So we are on high alert and everything today. But we have been occupying it was called Jefferson Square Park. It's in the heart of downtown Louisville, where the police department, the courts, and all of that are. And the reason why we are occupying is because Breonna Taylor was murdered by the police department on March 13th. And we said that we was going to occupy it until they were all fired, arrested, and prosecuted. As we was starting to march, protest, as everybody was in the nation, 3 days later, the National Guard came down and killed another one of our community members named David McAtee. And so the trauma that's going on in our community, we're just trying to have a healing space for everybody, because this is a lot for our community. A lot of people that are now just tuning in, we've been doing this for 20 plus years. It is nothing new for us, but we are sick and tired of it. And we are getting paid agitators in our camp to try to shut us down. It's just a lot. And just, yesterday, the white supremacists were supposed to come and counter protest and somehow chickened out. But yet a homeless person, a person that's houseless, end up leaving the camp, got kicked out of the camp for some odd reasons I can't recall right now, but came back fully dressed with a backpack and a gun and unloaded on our camp last night. And so we are, like I said, on high alert. There's not a lot of details that I can share right now, just overall in general. I know that there's only like 3 states in the United States that is occupying right now around police brutality. And so we have many demands, and it seems like we're going to be there forever, because these people act like they can't fire, arrest, and charge the 3 officers from 3 months ago. But yet the one person that did something yesterday, he was apprehended in 10 minutes. So that's just the system, But I'll take any questions real quick. I only have like 5% left on my phone. So if anybody has specific questions, I can answer those.
How can we support you? What can we do to help you? Solidarity to you from Los Angeles, Inglewood.
Okay. Thank you so much. You can follow me. I think David has all my information, and the KentuckyAlliance.org is the organization. It's 45 years old. It's a grassroots organization from Louisville. That's where most of the folks have been working out of, and we got 3 links that you can support on there for us, and we really appreciate it.
So more questions to Tia as her battery is very low, and then we'll get back to the speakers. Thank you very much for being with us, Tia. I can understand how tough that's been for you.
Thank you. And as soon as stuff calms down, I can definitely come back and share some more strategies and techniques and stuff that we've came across and demands that we are having. But today is just really not a good day. I just want to check in and tell you guys, thank you for your support and trying to understand what's going on in Louisville. It's really getting, it's getting to a heightened level of security now. And so we appreciate any of your thoughts and prayers as well.
Okay. Anyone just step forward if they have a question for Tia. Unmute, please.
To Siddiqui from Los Angeles. Can someone put in the chat information where we can extend support?
Yeah, that someone has already started doing that. So anyone who has ways and means of putting information in there, please do so. David, did you want to make a short question?
Well, just this. I'm looking for the exact links that you've mentioned here. We want to give you every support. We know you've been there every day, every night, and 3 o'clock in the morning, and handling every contradiction under the sun. Full solidarity. We're with you all the way, and I think I'm speaking for everybody, and from Africa too, right there.
Thank you. Thank you. It's called the Kentucky Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. It's 45 years old. It was started around Angela Davis. So if you just Google all of that, I'm sure it'll directly take you to the link. And then we're in Louisville, Kentucky.
Okay. Any other questions or messages for Tia?
Dave, I've got a question.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Sorry, I had to close the door. Yeah, hold on, let me turn my video on. Hold on just a second here. Oh, Tia, my name is Cheryl and I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area. My question for you is, do you see, in the midst of all of the crazy things that are going on, any chance of the development of a national movement, coordinated movement that can bring together, you know, at least in the big cities, the protests and the organizations like yours that have come together? Because it seems to me that ultimately that's going to be necessary to sustain this movement. Do you see any signs of that? Or how can we help in that?
I don't know. I mean, it's like at the very beginning, it was 50 states, they were protesting, but it just seemed like that was for a weekend. There's just certain states that are sustaining this because it's more rampant maybe than others, or just reaching out to the other states, because we had somebody from Milwaukee come, and her story yesterday was so horrific. It was even more horrific than ours, but yet no one is talking about it. I think just sharing some of the stories that come from the true grassroots organizers, because the national media and all this other media, they're sharing, you know, tainted truths to what's going on. And then if there is a collective way of organizing some of these groups together, that would be great. I know, and organizing a group, maybe a main national group with the demand. So we have, one of the wins that we had was that we passed the Breonna Law in our local ordinance, and we're going to take it to the state and hopefully national, and it prevents police departments from doing no-knock warrants. And that's what got her, because she was asleep, and they, even though they did knock, they didn't say who they were, but it was still 1 o'clock in the morning. And so, you know, policies like that, if we can all generally come around and do it on a national level, that will help some of the systemic problems.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you. All right. I appreciate you guys, and just stay in touch, and I will hopefully touch back with you guys soon. Thank you.
Tia, do you have an email address or something, or can we just best get in touch with you through that through that website? Or
here, I'll send you my email real quick in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, Tia, thank you very much from everyone. That was a really, really important contribution. Okay,
Thank you.
Tia, I'm going to mute you and you can put your email up. And the next speaker, now, as is the tradition in these meetings, it's not about speakers talking at everyone. There's going to be time for discussion. I think you would appreciate the nature of the speakers we've had has been absolutely necessary to hear firsthand what's going on from the States, because we're talking about a potentially revolutionary situation in the bastion of capitalism. So we need to hear what's going on. But the next speaker is Fando from South Africa. Hopefully you're there. If you are, can you unmute, please?
Hello there.
Okay, would you like to make your contribution?
Hi, it's Tando Kumete, but thank you very much for trying.
All right, Tando, apologies.
It's okay. So my contribution is going to be quite multi-layered and complex because of the nature of the space that I come from. South Africa is, as you know, the most unequal society in the world. And we've got a very rich history that I think a lot of you might be aware of. But let me start from the beginning. So people make the mistake of thinking, and I'm going to just start with our context and then I'm going to broaden out the discussion. A lot of people make a mistake of thinking that South Africa's oppression began in 1948 with the apartheid regime and the rising of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party. But formalized segregation and oppression in South Africa actually began in 1913, and informal segregation began, far before that as well. And so what we see today in South Africa is a very sophisticated system of oppression that is highly embedded in our society, and also is not only racist, but is also inherently misogynistic and heteronormative. And so what we see is something called white heteropatriarchy. What white heteropatriarchy is a system that says that if you are white, if you are male, if you are heterosexual, if you are able-bodied, and if you are of an elite class, then you are better and supreme to everyone else. So South Africa is really the birth country, or one of the main countries of what you call this white fatherhood that centers itself around dominating anything that isn't white, dominating anything that isn't a man, dominating anything that isn't heterosexual and able-bodied, etc. And I mean, this is why we still have statues of these white male figures that brought about white heteropatriarchy around the world through colonialism. Because when you have a statue, that statue represents what the value of that society is. And, you cannot use the lame excuse of saying that, well, this is a part of our history and our heritage because we have museums for that. When we display statues and all of these kind of public figures, when we have names like Verwoerd or Voortrekker around our spaces, that means that we value the people that brought those values into our spaces. And so therefore we also value those values in today's times. So, the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is because I need us to understand that, we are all being undermined by the same system of oppression, and that the same system of oppression that undermines Black bodies in the United States is the same system of oppression that we are dealing with currently in South Africa under a Black elitist government. And the difference, if you'll allow me to make this comparison, is that in South Africa, in America, of course, you have the 80-20 split, where it's 80% white people, and you have a white government, and then you've got everyone else being people of color. Whereas in South Africa, we have well over 80% Black population, and everyone else is of Indian heritage or white, and then we are also being led by a Black government. But the interesting thing is that white heteropatriarchy in our country is so deeply embedded that you don't need a white person in the room for an instance of white oppression to take place. It takes place on its own automatically, which is why you have police that kill, or rather soldiers that were killing Black bodies, especially during the pandemic. So what you'd have is that you'd have Black communities, especially your poorer Black communities, being hyper-militarized, hyper-policed. You'd have, white communities and white bodies who would flout the pandemic regulations and would be dealt with in a far lighter manner. For example, you had a woman who deliberately literally fought against the police, literally physically fought against the police, and the police did not apply any kind of force with her. Whereas Collins Khoza was a man who was sitting in his yard, in his own space, and you have a Black soldier who enters into his space and guns him down. But on top of that, beyond having, the kind of Black on Black violence, like Black state violence against ordinary Black people's body kind of violence, we also have violence in our own ordinary communities as Black people. And I especially want to highlight the issue of gender-based violence, which I think is probably one of the biggest betrayals in the Black community, is to see Black men being complicit and being the main perpetrators of gender-based violence against Black women's bodies. And if you understand the significance of Black women's bodies, not only now, but during the apartheid period, it just amplifies the insult. Black women are the biggest threat to white heteropatriarchy, not only currently, but historically. What used to happen is that because the apartheid system understood that the future of Black human existence is derived from the womb of a Black woman, what it tried to do then is to oppress Black women as much as possible. It did this by ensuring that Black women would be exploited more than Black men and more than white women. It did this by making sure that Black women stayed out of urban areas and out of white areas, so they'd come and work, do domestic work, and then have to be forced to go back into the peripheries of the city or go back into the rural areas. And on top of that, there was a whitewashed version of African culture that brainwashed Black women into thinking that they were subordinate to Black men and that their place was in rural South Africa and not in urban South Africa. Because there's an understanding that if Black women came into the urban areas, they would want to settle down with their Black husbands and begin to populate white spaces with Black lives, and more Black bodies would exist close to whiteness. And whiteness doesn't want that. There's nothing that irritates whiteness more than the Black body. And we see that that ideology and that way of thinking continues to exist today, in the fact that Black women still remain the face of unemployment, remain the face of oppression, remain the face of gender-based violence in our society at the hands of Black men. And so, historically, Black women have never owned land and continue to be, people that don't own land. So mine is to say that the death of George Floyd is very much connected to the death of Collins Khoza in our country, and very much also connected to the death of people like Anine Boyson and Tshegofatso Pule and Naledi Pagindao and all of these women who have been murdered brutally at the hands of people of color. And so when we speak about the Black Lives Matter movement, for me, in going forward, it needs to be a movement that is intersectional and not passively intersectional, not intersectional by accident, but intentionally and deliberately intersectional. When we say that Black Lives Matter, we mean all Black Lives Matter. We mean women Black Lives Matter. We mean children Black Lives Matter. We mean queer, Black queer bodies matter within the Black Lives Matter movement. We will never as a community liberate ourselves from white heteropatriarchy, which is what is happening. It is a manifestation of white heteropatriarchy in diverse spaces. We will never liberate ourselves as a Black community anywhere in the world if we are oppressing ourselves in our own communities. We cannot seek affirmation from other human beings when we fail to affirm one another behind closed doors. We have not made enough noise about gender-based violence in our communities, and we certainly haven't made much noise about the death of queer bodies, of queer Black bodies in our communities. We had a young colored Black man by the name of Kevin Fortain, who was brutally murdered in his community, and people have not raged at that. There are a number of Black queer bodies that have died or have disappeared at the hands of heteropatriarchy. And we haven't made a lot of noise about that because we don't see those people as being a part of us. When we say Black Lives Matter, what we really mean is that Black men's lives matter. We don't mean that Black women's lives matter, because if we did, then Black men and all of the communities, all of the people on this panel would be raging at the fact that Black women are the least paid in their communities. We would be raging at the fact that in homeless shelters, when a queer body enters into a homeless shelter, they are told to futek because they are gay or because they are lesbian or because they are transgender, whatever the case might be. So my contribution in this discussion is really that going forward, we need to have a very real discussion about what it is that we are fighting against, and to stop severing our movements. Stop talking about gender-based violence as a separate issue. It's not separate from Black Lives Matter. Stop talking about queerphobia as a separate thing from gender-based violence, because it's not a separate thing, it's the same thing. These are all the same systems of oppression. And if we can exist together, united, then I believe that the Black Lives Matter movement has got the potential of being the biggest movement the world has ever seen, aimed at dismantling white heteropatriarchy, killing it and burying it now and forevermore. Because we cannot live like this anymore. We cannot live in a society where the lines to get food parcels during a pandemic are as long as the lines of the voting queues in 1994 when South Africa first became a democracy. It is absolutely unacceptable. We cannot live any longer in a society where a police officer or where a Black soldier is more than comfortable with gunning down another Black body because he, in his mind, perceives that Black body as being inferior to a white body. There need not be a white heterosexual man in the room for society to put its knee on our necks so we cannot breathe, so we suffocate. There need not be a white heterosexual man in that room. We do that all by ourselves. And the starting point for us is to begin to see ourselves diverse, our diverse selves as mattering to one another, to ourselves. Black diverse bodies need to matter to Black people before Black lives can matter to the rest of the world. Facts. That's it for now. If anyone has any questions, then I'm willing to take a couple of questions about the South African context.
Sono i confini, rosse bandiere,